is a little dim. Well, the topic of my talk today is women and men as partners in peace, the struggle for sustainable family and community. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the person up here in the right-hand corner. That's Wangari Maathai, a Nobel Prize winner. And I thought it was kind of cool that in the program, my name's on the page with Wangari Maathai's image in it. I think that happened to somebody else here today, too. And I chose this picture because she's shaking hands with another Kenyan. He's Stephen Kabera Karanja, who's a human rights lawyer living in exile. He's at the Norwegian Center for Human Rights in the Faculty of Law at the University of Oslo. And I put this up here because I'm going to be talking a lot about women as peace builders, but also I am going to be working towards making some points about how women are not necessarily doing this in isolation from their relationships with men or the kinds of support, mentorship, and partnerships with men that we all can benefit from. Let's see how this works. Oops, that went too far. All right, sorry this is so dark. Peace depends on the presence of a sustainable support structure for families and communities, and I think we've been hearing a little bit about this from some of the other presenters today. Albert Einstein, I think you all know who he is, wrote, "Peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice, of law, of order, in short, of government." And government doesn't necessarily have to mean, large impersonal structures. It means the kinds of organizations that we've been hearing about today. For example, Tony D'Amico was just telling us about some community-based organizations that you could all actually begin and participate in yourselves. Peacebuilding, this is a quote, by the way, from John Yema, who is the Christian Science Monitor editor, and he said, "Peacebuilding is 10,000 small, practical things, because young men without jobs and too much time on their hands are easily coaxed into fighting. Peacebuilders then have to work creating jobs. Schools and health clinics help war-battered families mend. Professionally trained lawyers, judges, and administrators instill confidence that the system is not rigged to favor the few. Utilities and roads foster a sense of progress. Free and fair elections encourage people to feel that they are the actual owners of their nation." So peace is something that has to have structural support to thrive. The victims of conflict around the world include more than military combatants. A significant proportion of deaths in nearly all conflicts are actually civilians. The traumas of war impact a broad range of people beyond the battleground and beyond borders. This is, I've got to stay tethered here. This is Lema Gbowe, and she was the 2011, one of 3 2011 Nobel Peace Prize laureates. She said, "When women and men make peace, we're not just talking about guns coming down. It's about children going back to school, broken women becoming whole again." And I thought of her because I certainly know that I felt very inspired when women received the Nobel Peace Prize, or any other Nobel Prize, as a matter of fact. And in particular, we've seen some especially inspiring Nobel Prize winners in recent years, and many of them are people that we might want to think about as potential role models. Oops, wait. Oh, sorry. You might want to know a little bit more about Leah Gbowe. She's a Liberian survivor of that country's lengthy civil war. As a consequence of her own traumas, she became involved in learning about how to engage in trauma healing, and she became a reconciliation specialist. She later went on to get a master's degree in peace building from Eastern Mennonite University, studying with Ethiopian-born conflict and reconciliation expert Hezekias Asefa, who's on the left, and American-born Howard Zehr, a specialist in restorative justice. That's like the Truth and Reconciliation committees that were established, you probably heard, in South Africa. So these are examples of how men can be mentors and also partners, allies, facilitators. Lema Gbowe also organized other Liberian women to negotiate an actual end to the Liberian Civil War. That was no mean feat. And her efforts in this regard are featured in the 2008 documentary film Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which I would certainly recommend for you. We have to be serious and realistic and think about, well, what are the challenges to peace building in times of conflict? Okay? Conflict tends to do a number of things. It removes many productive members of the community. It damages infrastructure, and it displaces the survivors. Conflict generates mobile and needy populations of refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced persons, and migrants. Family and community structures are severely reconfigured by conflict, and rebuilding family and community life following conflict is difficult and oftentimes falls on the shoulders of the most vulnerable survivors, who have, of course, very limited resources. Like ripples in a pond, conflict generates effects that reach well beyond the point of origin. And in fact, many conflicts today involve international, regional, and global stakeholders. Unfortunately, poorly managed resettlement programs, rehabilitation programs, reconciliation programs actually can generate new conflicts, and it becomes then an endless cycle. So these are the challenges that lay ahead of us. The picture, by the way, at the bottom is of Yazidi refugees who are fleeing from Syria right now. So the question is, who are the peace builders, and what are they doing, and how do they break the cycle of conflict then? So who inspires us? I'm particularly inspired by people like Malala Yousafzai. We've seen a picture of her earlier today, and Kailash Satyarthi. These were co-winners of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014, that's last year. And one of the interesting things that I've noticed, the commonalities between these two seemingly very different people, is that their central theme is the importance of a significant investment in youth education. Here we are at a community college. I think we all understand the importance of education. And yet I think it remains to be seen whether significant enough investments are being made in that education, particularly in areas of conflict. So Malala Yousafzai said, "Let us pick up our books and our pens. They are the most powerful weapons. One child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world." And Kailash Satyarthi said, "I refuse to accept that the world is so poor when just 1 week of global spending on armies is enough to bring all of our children into classrooms." And you know, in fact, Maria Montessori, the founder of those Montessori schools and the Montessori educational model, also had something to say about this. She said, "Establishing lasting peace is the work of education. All politics can do is just keep us out of war." And sometimes it's not too good at doing that, right? I'm an anthropologist, and I spent a lot of time doing research in Africa. I worked with a variety of different communities. One community I worked with quite a lot, and still do, is the Somali community. So this page says, no, Somalis are not all pirates, or terrorists for that matter. I want to start out, I want to talk about this by greeting you in Somali using the most common word for a greeting, and it is nabad. Nabad means peace. Now that may surprise you, because the image that we get here of the Somali people is that they are very, very warlike, that they're hardly peaceful at all. And I'm thinking of something that President Wes Bryan said this morning. He said, it takes a peaceful people to make peace. And we tend not to think of the Somalis as peaceful people. So it's easy for us to sort of write off the Somali as causing their own problem. When we think of Somalis, we think about pirates, we think about Al-Shabaab. And I'd like to suggest to you that that's an overly simplistic way of thinking of things, and that's not the whole story. For Somalis deeply appreciate, understand, and crave peace. So what are they doing about it? Well, these are two Somali physicians, Dr. Hawa Abdi and Dr. Osman Mahmoud Dufle, who have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for their continued medical work in areas racked by conflict. And they play a particularly important role in inspiring other Somalis and helping people in the community recover from the long-term effects of conflict. And they make me think about one of my heroes in anthropology. I don't know if you've heard of him or not. His name is Dr. Paul Farmer, who has also been recommended as a possible recipient of the Nobel Prize. And he's both an anthropologist and a physician, and he started his own health organization called Partners in Health. It's based primarily in Haiti, but it's expanding to various places around the world that are particularly in need of health care assistance. And he has argued very strongly that I believe health care is a human right. And so really, I think it's important to consider the relationship between peace building and making sure that we really think very carefully about what is a human right. and including things like education and basic health care as human rights, because it's going to be very difficult to build peace without those things in our lives. We can see in Somali life also more challenges to peace building. That's oftentimes considered to be a failed state, Somalia, and we can see conflict going on there all the time, and they seem to now be exporting conflict. And so we can see there are a lot of challenges to peace building, but one of the things I've noticed in following the Somali community over the years is that with more challenges come actually more peace builders. You're going to find more, you just have to know where to look for them. Somali women have been widely recognized as being instrumental in the struggle to restore peace and stability to communities that are challenged by civil war, refugee flight and resettlement, difficult reconstruction efforts, and continuing conflict. There are a number of women who've come to prominence in this regard in Somali life, and I've got some pictures of a couple of them here. This is going clockwise. We have Asha Ahmed Abdallah, Asha Haji Elmi Amina, Edna Adnan Ismail, Hibak Osman, and then in the far right corner we have a Somali man I'll talk about in a minute. These are women who have done some really important things in trying to build peace in the Somali community. The three on the left there are all women who got involved in local peace-building organizations with other women, and from that organizing experience then went on to become involved in national level politics and have run for political office. And there's a younger woman who's recently come out and said that she's actually going to run for the presidency in Somalia. So many studies of women who get involved in peace-building efforts in many parts of the world have suggested that conflict, although obviously conflict is terrible, oftentimes what happens is women come to the fore in peace-building efforts, and then once they get involved in doing that, they oftentimes then take the next step into moving into new kinds of leadership opportunities, new kinds of leadership positions. So it's a bit ironic, but oftentimes conflict eventually will produce change and oftentimes encourage women to move into leadership positions, and we certainly see this here. The woman on the right over here is my friend Edna Adna Ismail. She's a nurse, and she's built now 2 hospitals in Somalia, and she has a nurse training program, nurse midwife training program. She's also a campaigner against female genital cutting, and she's been recognized in the Half the Sky movement of Nicholas Kristof, and so you can actually find a lot of information about her in his writings and also on YouTube. You can Google her. She's a very inspiring person. And on the bottom is my friend Yusuf Hassan. He's one of the most well-recognized Somali men in peace building. He's Kenyan-born. He's actually from the area that just was attacked by Al-Shabaab, Garissa. He's a media expert who formerly worked for the UNHCR, that's the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and he's now a Kenyan member of parliament and has a reputation as a very strong and effective advocate for projects that reduce both poverty and conflict, because you can't reduce one without the other. Now, I know a lot of people here have been talking about, whoops, went a little too far there, the role of arts and creativity in peace building, and that's important in the Somali community as well. The Somali are actually known as a nation of poets. You might not think that, but they are. Traditional poems, known as gabe, are poems primarily performed by men, and in the past they most frequently dealt with war, but in recent decades the theme has shifted to the very urgent need for peace. So you can see in the Somali community among the men themselves there's an acute awareness of the importance of this, and they're shifting their poetic traditions accordingly. The greatest living poet in the Somali language, oftentimes compared to Shakespeare, is Muhammad Ibrahim Warsame Hadrawi, and he's a vocal peace advocate. He's traveled all over the world trying to convince Somalis in the diasporic community, as well as within Africa itself, to more effectively try to organize for peace. And I have a quote here about him from another friend of mine who's a famed journalist in the diaspora, and he says, Hadrawi continued to preach peace, stability, and nonviolence in the Somali Peninsula during his long journey to peace overseas. In his interviews, he challenges faction leaders and warlords gathering to create a political system that builds trust in institutions, including an independent judiciary, freedom of speech and association among other human rights, and an end to their narrow political ping-pong and bickering once and for all. Well, it's also important to know that Somali women have a poetic voice as well, and there's a very special form of women's poem called Barambur, And we see in women's barambur compositions today, both back in Africa and in the diaspora, a lot of examples of how women are using this poetic form also to advocate for peace. So I'm going to read you a piece of one of the songs or poems written by Adar Abdi Fido, a Somali woman. Anti-peace elements and belligerent men who are yet unprepared for it, we are ready to challenge them and convince them to join the peace process. Somali women, whichever your country of abode, be reminded of action in this obligation. Somali womenfolk, strive to keep your warmongering men in the bounds of morality. Wives should preach peace and reconciliation to their partners at home. Where are the writers and university professors, and why don't they produce peace literature? Why don't you propagate and consolidate peace regardless of your clan of origin? So we see examples of ways in which basic grassroots artistic production is speaking of the Somali people's desire for peace and putting pressure on leaders to emerge in the community who can actually make this happen. In this regard, it's important to understand that peace builders oftentimes have to take roles that put them out in public view and that force them to take risks. They sometimes come forward and involve themselves in activities that make them targets of other people, of critics, and also of sometimes police forces of various kinds. Some of these people end up, of course, in jail. Two examples that I think of often in terms of fighting for justice and the notion that no justice means no peace are two Indian activists that you may have heard of, Vandana Shiva and Arundhati Roy. And we have a picture of Vandana Shiva here over the left, and she has said, it's not an investment if it's destroying the planet. And Arundhati Roy, it's odd how those who dismiss the peace movement as utopian don't hesitate to prefer the most absurdly dreamy reasons for going to war, to stamp out terrorism, install democracy, eliminate fascism, and most delusionally, to rid the world of evildoers. These are very outspoken women, and you can oftentimes see them in the media. You can find a lot of presentations by them on YouTube if you like. And what's interesting is that they are speaking not just as women for women, but they are speaking for all of the poor and disenfranchised, for women and men together. And they represent an example of a kind of third world, it's sometimes called third world approach to feminism, in which the point is not just to have women stand up for women alone, but to think about ways in which both women and men should be partners in building a more just and peaceful world. Vandana Shiva is known for responding to some of the more destructive elements in the corporate globalization of the world's food supply. I'd like to thank Tony D'Amico for his presentation. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And also, I was glad he mentioned the Orange County Harvest Club because I was a founding member of it. So it's nice to see the next generation embracing these things. And you cannot emphasize, I think, enough the importance of these issues of having adequate, healthy food for everybody. So in India in particular, some of these problematic impacts of corporate globalization of the world's food supply have led to terrible catastrophes like mass farmer suicide. Some of you may have heard of that. And so Vandana Shiva, in response, has created a program of sustainable grassroots-based farming using locally based farming methods. And she trains people in those methods all around the world. She was here, I think, last year in downtown LA talking with people in Watts about urban community gardens. And she also has a big project called the Navdanya Project in her hometown of Dehradun in North India. And she speaks out very strongly on these issues. You can see here she says, seeds controlled by Monsanto, agribusiness trade controlled by Cargill, processing controlled by Pepsi and Philip Morris, retail controlled by Walmart is a recipe for food dictatorship. We must occupy the food system to create food democracy. Food democracy, I think, is a book title of hers as well. And this image is from a movie called Dirt. And Chip actually has shown this movie at his Orange County Peace Center. And it's a movie I would also strongly recommend for those of you who are interested in these issues. Arundhati Roy is someone who has responded with her activism to government suppression of vulnerable minorities and to mass displacement of rural folk by large-scale, globally financed development projects. Some of you may have seen in the last week, there have been a number of articles in the news about a study that has shown pretty definitively that the World Bank, which tends to sponsor these very large development projects, has actually contributed immensely to immiseration and more poverty, and is accomplishing almost the opposite of what they set out to do. And anthropologists, of course, have been pointing this out for quite some time. I'm kind of wondering why the news media just discovered this, but there you go. Arundhati Roy has been speaking out on these issues specifically as they affect people in India, but also she thinks very globally. You may be aware of a book that she wrote that won a major prize many years ago called The God of Small Things. So she's a novelist who then subsequently turned to political activism. She's a prolific writer and speaker. She has spoken together with people like Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky and some of these other very progressive public intellectuals. And she sort of wages peace with her pen. I don't like to use sort of idioms of sort of military sorts, but I think wages peace is maybe a good one anyway. She frequently practices civil disobedience. She's been beaten and jailed in many occasions for coming out and speaking out on these issues. So she's very articulate about this, and I would recommend her work as well. Another hero of mine is Wangari Maathai. And I like her because she looks at the root causes of conflict and thinks about small ways in which you can start to take action so you don't feel totally overwhelmed by the problem. Where do you start is oftentimes the question. So one of the things that she said is, it's evident that many wars are fought over resources, which are now becoming increasingly scarce. If we conserved our resources better, fighting over them would not then occur. So protecting the global environment is directly related to securing peace. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. Unfortunately, she's since passed away. Prior to her winning the Peace Prize, she endured police violence and jail for her activism on behalf of democratic political rights of both men and women in Kenya, and even for her environmental activism. Here's something that she says about her Greenbelt movement, which is what won her the prize. Unless we properly manage resources like forests, water, land, minerals, and oil, we will not win the fight against poverty, and there will not be peace. Old conflicts will rage on, and new wars will erupt unless we change the path we are on. Her approach has oftentimes been referred to as ecofeminism, and I don't think that she ever rejected that phrase, nor would Arundhati Roy or Vandana Shiva. But again, this is a kind of feminism that is inclusive, and it expects to have male mentors, male allies, male witnesses, male partners involved in all of this. It's not an exclusivist type of feminism by any means. There's a very good film that's been made about Wangari Maathai called Taking Root, which you can get on Amazon if you like, I think. And it tells her story and the struggles that she has gone through as an activist. But I want to leave you with some sort of more inspiring ideas that have come from Wangari Maathai. She said, "It's the little things citizens do. That's what will make a difference. My little thing is planting trees." Well, planting trees, as it turns out, is not at all a little thing, particularly not in Kenya, where if you plant a tree, you're essentially laying claim to land rights, and that's very, very political, as it is in many parts of the world. But planting a tree or two or three, and better yet, persuading other people to plant trees, and then organizing entire communities to plant trees, can begin a revolution, and you have to start somewhere. Now, for those of you who are thinking about trying to inspire young people and students, I like this quote from Wangari Maathai. She said, "It's very important for young people not to be afraid of engaging in areas that are not common to the youth. Get involved in local activities. Get involved in local initiatives. Be involved in leadership positions because you cannot learn unless you are involved. And if you make mistakes, that's all right too, because we all make mistakes, and we learn from those mistakes. You gain confidence from learning, failing, and rising again." And I'm humbled that the two preceding speakers, much younger than me, had that message first. It says something. I need to listen to my students more, right? I do, actually. I learn a lot from my students. What conclusions can we come to here? Effective grassroots peace building involves both women and men. Men and women may have different roles in conflict situations and different styles of peace building, but unless they cooperate on common goals, conflict will continue and peace building will be ineffective. It's important to look at the root causes of conflict. These must be addressed for peace building to be sustainable. And if it's not sustainable, we're just going to be back here again. Processes that undercut family formation, household security, and community sustainability will undermine peace. So we need to have support structures, and that means having systems of governance that will provide and maintain those support structures. Significant inequalities always contribute to conflict. So we have to pay attention to that issue of inequality. It is absolutely fundamental. We need to always ask if basic needs, things like water, clean water, land, food, education, and healthcare, aren't they human rights? Shouldn't we start thinking in those ways? And what does that mean? If something is a human right, what are we prepared to do to make sure that everyone has those rights? It's also important to remember that peacemakers themselves are sometimes targeted. They need support from each other and from the community, as well as from systems of governance, both local and global. They have to have support. And as Aung San Suu Kyi said, where there is no justice, there can be no secure peace. Thank you.